So, Waymaker. Waymaker is a package put together by Lumen Learning that combines OER materials with what they call a personalized learning system. It's not fully adaptive, but it has some of the same features of adaptive learning systems. And let's talk a little bit about it. The way this is done is they put together a team of experts in any discipline where they have a course, and they come up with a list of learning outcomes. Here's an example from the Introduction to Business class, where there's 18 primary outcomes, there's 93 enabling outcomes that are needed to reach those primary outcomes, and there's 308 specific skill level outcomes, which makes for this really neat little diagram here. And they do something similar in all of their courses. So it's very tightly done. It's designed using a backwards design process where they start with what skills students what learning objectives students should acquire, and then they build a system that helps students reach that. The system is interactive. Students do some reading, which is based on OER materials, and within that reading, there is embedded practice. So they'll read a block of text on a specific topic, and then they'll work through some problems on that right in the reading. There's also some very high quality videos. In the economics course, many of them comes from the Crash Course series, and they're very well done, and they're integrated very nicely with the text around it. In terms of the design, there's a lot of retrieval practice built in. There's a set of practice questions that students work through before they end up taking essentially the equivalent of a module quiz. And then once they complete all that material, they take a quiz at the end, which summarizes all the material in that module. And typically, it's designed so that a module would last for a week or so of a typical semester. And they're given 2 opportunities to complete that with different questions each time. And that's done for each module throughout the course. One of the nice things about it is that for the rest of the world, students have to pay $25 for access to a Lumen Learning Waymaker module. But in SUNY, there's a system license or a system agreement with Lumen Learning, where in return for a lump sum payment from SUNY, anyone in the SUNY system can adopt Lumen Learning's Waymaker package and use it for free. So the cost is 0 to students, and that reduces the barriers to access for a lot of students. It's basically providing OER content with many of the same features that students would get through publisher-provided content. And the quality of it is quite comparable to, in terms of the interactive features that provided with most of the major publishers. The main advantage of all of this is that students have first day free access to all the materials in the course. It's equitable so that students who are able to pay for the textbooks up front don't have that privilege or don't have that advantage. This particularly benefits first-gen students and students from low-income households who often delay the purchase of materials, which these students in general are at much greater risk of not completing courses or making progress towards a degree. And this tends to reduce that achievement gap quite a bit, or that completion gap. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. In terms of the interactive components, here's something from an economics class, from the economics class that I'm using. And basically what happens is students are given a question, they're shown a graph, they're asked what will happen when under certain circumstances, and then they just basically they get to see if they're correct or not, and then they can keep doing that over and over again with different questions until they've mastered that content. This is referred to as a doer effect, and there's some significant evidence from this paper and others, it's a study done by Carnegie Mellon, that the act of working through these problems and interacting with the content is fairly effective. They found a really large effect that the learning effect of doing is 6 times greater. That's on the high end of most of this research, but there's a lot of research that finds that the more students engage with the material, the more they actively process material and work with it, the more they tend to recall both in the short term and in the long term. And when they try these questions that are embedded in the reading, they get immediate feedback, so they get to see if they're correct or incorrect, and if it's incorrect, why it's incorrect, and then they get to try it again. And then they can keep getting other questions until they master it. And at the each module starts with what's called a show what you know, and we'll jump over to the course and take a look at that in just a moment. But for each module, there's a little bit of pre-testing. So students are given questions that essentially deal with the learning objectives in that module, and then their responses to that help determine what areas they need to focus their attention on. And we'll see that in the course itself in just a few minutes. But basically, they're tested on the major components of the module, and if they already learned it, they're told they don't really need to spend much time on those components, but for the things that they need to work on more, they're given feedback that suggests that these are areas they should focus their attention on, and it's color-coded so that different colors indicate whether they've mastered it. And once it turns green, that means they've mastered that material and they can move on to other materials there. So the pretest is not only useful in terms of assessing what students already come in knowing, it's also really useful because pretesting has been shown to be an important component, or tend to be really helpful in increasing long-term recall of content. A simple explanation that's sometimes used for that is by testing students on material before they learned it, it's essentially training their brain that this is something they should know, which makes it more likely that they'll encode the information for later retrieval. In any case, pre-testing, asking students questions before they've learned the material, tends to encourage learning, and there's a lot of studies that have found this. So it activates prior knowledge. When they're trying to answer it, they're thinking about what they already know and which makes it easier for them to fit new knowledge into that framework, and it helps form this initial study plan. And as I just said, it increases knowledge retention and transfer, the ability to apply these concepts in new areas. So there's formative assessment throughout. Here's an example of a question, but one of the nice things with this is it also assesses students' metacognition. So when they're asked a question to check their understanding, they're also told, well, they're also responding with whether they're guessing, whether they're pretty sure or very sure, and then they get feedback on that. So it directly addresses some issues of metacognition so that students perhaps can learn to be more effective in assessing what they do know and what they don't know, because they're getting feedback on where they thought that they knew something really well, and then they get feedback that says, well, you rated your understanding this fairly high, but you still have much more to work through. Unlike adaptive learning systems where there's some underlying process or artificial intelligence component which determines the path that students go through the material, for each course module, it lists the major subtopics in that module, and it shows students what they need to work on. So in this particular module, there's 3 subcomponents on energy and metabolism, ATP and living systems, and cellular respiration. Within that, you notice the bottom part comes from that pre-testing, where it shows they're on track. That means they have made some progress towards that. But the section that needs work, they're told that's something they need to focus more of their efforts on. And it tells them why. So it says you missed some of the outcomes on your show what you know pretest. So it helps students direct their study efforts to the topics that they understand least well. And that's done in every module throughout the course. And when they take the test, instructors get feedback, where instructors can look at all of the module quizzes at the end. And when they take the quiz the first time, instructors get feedback telling them whether students have attained mastery on their initial quiz attempt, and they're given the option of providing students with feedback. One of the things that really impressed me about this was that this automated feedback, some of the feedback is automated, others come from the instructor, but the structure that's set up gives students a lot of feedback on how they're doing. If they do poorly, they get feedback suggesting that they may need to work on this material a bit more, and it gives them specific areas where they need to work on. But when students are below a lower threshold on the first quiz, the instructor is given encouragement to send a message, which you pre-configure. Generally, it asks them to come in and talk to you or work with you on the areas they have some topics on. But students, whenever they take a quiz, if they do well, they get feedback congratulating them, where there's a variety of forms of automated messages. When they're not doing so well, they also get some feedback which suggests that they need to work more. But it's varied a bit. I believe there's 2 or 3 of each type. I think there's 2 or 3 or 4 different types of message for positive and negative feedback. And again, instructors here have the option of clicking on the message and sending a personalized note where you can add other details to it based on the template that you created at the beginning. And every day, basically, I was using this in a class of over 300 students. Every day I get this message telling me how many students failed to reach mastery on their first attempt. And then I go through and determine whether to send messages. If they scored at 70 or below, I generally sent them a message encouraging them to stop in and talk about it. If they were between 70 and 80, I generally did, or if they were between 75 and 80, I generally didn't. You can set the threshold. I set it at 80%. And in general, one of the nice things is that I got so many students responding to these messages. Even though they knew they were automated messages, they'd respond by saying, well, I was rushing a little bit. I just didn't have enough time. I'm sorry, next time I'll study this in more detail. And it was really impressive. It was kind of overwhelming at first, but it was really nice that the students were perceiving us as personalized feedback, and they were responding to it, that they were taking a little bit more ownership of how they were doing. And if they did well, they sent a note back thanking me for my congratulations on the note. So I was getting a lot of those emails, and so were the students. But it did seem to help build a better connection, and I had many more students coming in and talking to me after class during office hours than I've ever seen before. So that aspect of it worked really well. And this is kind of the same basic thing. We just talked about that. And here's an example of the types of feedback. This is one that much of these slides were taken from Lumen Learning. I gave a presentation with them a while back, and they shared the slides. So this is some sample feedback where it says, hi, Daniel. It inserts the name of the person, and it suggests in this case that they needed to spend a little more time working on those 2 topics, and inviting them to come by and talk about how they're doing, and so forth. So, and here's a sample of some feedback that came from a student. And I got a lot of emails that look remarkably similar to this. And here's another sample. One of the nice things about Lumen Learning's Waymaker package is they're constantly evaluating every semester. At the end of the semester, they evaluate how students did in achieving specific learning outcomes. And if they find that, they look at 2 things. One is the amount of time that students spend working on material for each learning module, and secondly, on how well they've done on their assessments. And they devote most of their time and improvement strategies on those areas where students have spent a lot of time working on the content and yet still are not achieving the learning objectives. At that point, they go back and first they reevaluate their assessments to make sure that they really are capturing what they want to be capturing. And if it appears that the assessments are reasonable ways of capturing this, then they go back and they rebuild those portions of the course to help students become more effective. So, this isn't quite like a standard textbook where in introductory economics, for example, a new textbook comes out every 3 years where there'll be some changes based on feedback. They're changing this every semester to some extent, to help students become more effective in their learning. And I've been quite impressed by that sort of process. And here's an example of some of the data that they use, where they look at the average scores on the aligned segments and the average views of the content, and they see how well those two match. We can jump ahead a little bit. One of the things that really convinced me to try this was this graph here, that we know that students from low-income households, first-gen students in general, tend to have much higher drop-fail and withdrawal rates. They're much more likely to drop out of college, and they're also much more likely to get lower grades in introductory classes. One way they assessed this when they were evaluating this was they looked at a random sample of students using OER content, where half of them were using the Waymaker package and half of them were just using the underlying text without the interactive content. And what they found basically is that for the Pell eligible students that were not using Waymaker, their average grade in the class was at 2.33. For those that were using Waymaker, the average grade was a 2.67, which was not significantly different than the non-Pell eligible students. So essentially what happened is the achievement gap between low-income households, students from low-income households, and students who were above that threshold of Pell eligibility essentially disappeared. And so that was a fairly strong result based on a study that was done in 2016, and they're still doing these types of analyses. So this was a really strong selling point for me. Now, there's a lot of materials out there. If anyone is watching this and would like to think about adopting this, just go to this website, lumenlearning.com/courses, or the link that was up on the screen a minute ago, and it will tell you all that's available. Lumen Learning provides not only their Waymaker, they provide OER textbooks, but they also provide, in addition to Waymaker, materials from OLI, which is the Open Learning Initiative materials that came out of Carnegie Mellon, who was one of the first places to build and implement artificial intelligence systems to provide adaptive learning. And there's going to be a growing number of those courses in this as well. So that's basically, and you can click on any of these links to see the variety of materials. Let me just, for example, click on social science, and we'll see there's quite a bit out there. Once the website adjusts, I guess we have to accept cookies first, maybe. Maybe that's not, there we go. And here we go. So now, you notice for some things there's a Waymaker version, for others it's not. Candela is just a standard OER textbook, basically. And you notice, so for statistics, for psychology, sociology, lifespan development, and microeconomics, which is what I'm using, macroeconomics, there are Waymaker versions of that. For all the others, they just provide the OER content, all of which is entirely free within the SUNY system. Now, just to hop over to my course as an example of this, I'm just going to hop in to one of the segments here and show you what it looks like. Basically, in the module, there's a series of modules where I put the due dates in. You import it into a Blackboard course, just like any Blackboard shell, and it automatically creates a series of folders for each module. And then it starts with the Succeeding with Waymaker module, which you generally assign to students at the very beginning, and that gives students directions on how to use it, and it's built using the same structure. So while they work through that, they're also learning how to navigate the system. Let's just jump over, say, to, let's say perfect competition. And in each module, there is a study plan where this is the basic system they interact with until they're ready to take the module quiz. And it's all done through an LTI integration. It starts by motivating the material, talking about why this material is important, why it might be salient or relevant to students, to help build some connection to the material from the very beginning. It goes to a show what you know thing where you get that pretest, and then it goes through a series of modules and then there's a summary section here, or sub-modules here, and then there's a subsection here, followed by the ultimate quiz, which is also linked separately in that folder. But just to hop in as an example, let's say we want to look at the long run and efficiency in perfectly competitive markets. And here, some students struggled here a little bit with 47% on average, but by the time they got to the quiz, they had a 73%. And there were 435 quiz attempts out of the 300 students. So not everyone needed that second attempt on there. But in any case, if we hop in here, here is an example of the content. And basically, you just start off with a reading, and it lets you try something, and then you move through. Well, there's some questions. I'm sorry, I jumped in at a kind of bad place. Let me go back again to the previous screen. And let's go here to the introductory section. And here's the reading. You just keep going through screen after screen to read it. And all the material comes from an OER textbook. It tells you what the learning objectives is up front, gives you some examples within it. It gives you the try it thing, generally every other screen or so. And then if there's positive economic profits, entry will do what? It's going to shift where positive profits, it will not going to really do it well. In any case, let's just pretend it's going to shift the marginal. It's going to actually, the marginal cost is, that's not an ideal question. Sorry about that. But that is actually the correct answer. The marginal cost curve is a firm supply curve, but it's not really, well, never mind. Usually they're better than that, but here is an example. This comes from MR University, Marginal Revolutionary University. There's a nice little video here that
now you might ask, why would firms remain in an industry if profits are zero?
So
zero profits.
There's a nice little video explaining things, and those are integrated all through here, and generally they're pretty high quality videos, and so forth until you get to the end, and then you get to that module test and you get to see how it goes. And now from the instructor's standpoint, if I come back up here, I'm not going to look at anything that involved grades. You can put any other material in there. These were Presley slides I used in the presentation. And the actual grading I did was a combination of in-person class, the integrated quizzes, clicker scores, as well as a midterm and final type. Yes?
Is it possible to, so I just looked up the courses, and there's actually like a college success one, which
yes, there is.
Center is working, we do the ED 104 and GST 315. Mm-hmm. However, the amount of content that's in that college success course is way more than we'd be able to cover in a quarter, 1 credit course. Is there a way that you can select specific content? Okay.
So, and the way I did it is I put everything into one folder. Here it was a microeconomics one, and this is where it all started. And I used every module except for this one. But basically, I put everything in this folder that was hidden from students. And when I wanted to open the material, you basically just copy it into the folder that's displayed. So the content folder is where I put all the content, but I started off with just this first module. You could mix and match any components you want. So you could just choose a subset of the modules that come with it, or you can even go in and edit the modules and take sections out. And if you take a section out, the content out, it will also take away the questions that are based on that section. So you can mix and match any combination of these materials.
That's really cool. Okay, thank you.
And and you can reorder them. If you reorder them, it will reorder the structure. They really have it set up quite nicely to make
it really responsive and as to what you do.
In what sense?
So like you were saying, if we rearrange something, it would also rearrange, so it's responsive to like the action that we take, it adjusts for that?
Yes. Okay. So I can go in, and I think I can do it this way. No, I haven't actually done anything other than rearranging some of the tests. So I know you can do it. Let me just see how you do it. I think you might do it with clicking on the gear. Here we go. So you can move this, you could edit the self-check, or you could delete that whole section. So if you only want to do some of the components within one of the modules, you could rearrange them, or you could delete them, or you could move them to other modules, and all the testing materials would move with it.
Okay, cool.
So, yeah. So, you could pick and choose and just use parts.
Great, thanks.
Well, and you get results, actually, if we go back up a little bit more. I put it here, but I don't want to open this in detail, but in here, for example, you have the faculty tools, and that's where you can see all the grades for students. And if students are given 2 attempts, but sometimes they have to complete a quiz within a given time period. If they don't, they lose their attempt, but you can go back and give them additional attempts. Usually they'll only do that once, but if they screwed up or the network went down, or if they lost power, or if something else came up, you can give them additional attempts. And I probably had about 100 of those from the 300 students I was working with 14 modules over the course of the semester. So it really wasn't all that often, but it did happen, a couple of times a week. But it's really simple. You just go in, you click on their name, and you give them an additional attempt.
Cool.
And it also comes with all these additional materials. You could use their PowerPoints, assignments, problem sets. There's question banks that come with it, and so forth. And that all works pretty nicely. And here, this is where you set up the messages, and you can look at. Let me see, I think I can do it here. Set up communication, and it recommends you turn it on, and I would strongly recommend that. And basically, you can choose how often you got materials. I only did it once a day, because each time a recommendation is triggered, when you've got 300 students, that could be pretty often. But you probably want some notification. And then you can define you define dates. You choose the personality of the messages. I went with the advisor one, which is kind of straightforward, but you can also go with the coach ones, which is much more, more of a cheerleader type thing. But if we look at the sample messages, they're pretty positive, and I was more comfortable with that tone. It was closer to my tone than the others. So you're still congratulating students, but maybe there's fewer exclamation points, there's fewer colloquial things, and so on. So that fit me better, but you could choose either one, and then you can customize it to however you like. So if you go with this, these are there's for study tips when they've used less. So before they do anything else, if they start to take the quiz and they haven't completed at least 25% of the practice quizzes, they get an automated message saying, they should use these quizzes before they take it. And there's 3 variations of the messages. This is the basic structure, but this shows how it looks, and you can rearrange them however you'd like. And again, it varies them a little bit so that students don't keep getting the same thing each time they do that. And similarly, there's 4 messages congratulating them for doing well. So that's the basic system.
Well, do you know what percentage of faculty are using this? Are you the only one?
On campus, I think I'm the only one so far. I've been trying to convince other people in economics to do it. I'm hoping that Liz will do it with a large class next time. The advantage of the day 1 access and no cost is really nice. We had been using the direct digital access, I think it's called, where students paid this extra fee as a course fee, basically. But free is even nicer.
Definitely. As sitting in our office, so many students come in, I just couldn't afford the book. I couldn't afford the online code. And it's really unfortunate that, that's what's preventing them from being successful. Yeah,
and the students who are most at risk in general are the ones who have the least access to the resources that can help them. And this equalizes that. And that was really why I wanted to do it.
Really cool. And, SUNY pays for it, so.
Yeah, and they don't pay that much. I mean, even if the students had to pay for it, it's only $25, which And when it's adopted by an institution, it's even less per student. When it's adopted by a whole system, I don't think it costs all that much for SUNY as a whole. And we have it for the next at least 2.5 years because it's a 3-year contract, and this is our second 3-year contract. So,
well, I might be trying to utilize some of the student success or college success modules, so I might be coming to you for help.
oh, sure. It's really, basically you get these modules, you just load them in and let them go. But again, you do have the options of removing things that you can't use or you don't have the time to use or whatever.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for the tutorial.
Oh, well, it was a quick overview, but I've been impressed by it. So, and I wanted to use OER for a long time, but I want to also give students the ability to do some practice and get some feedback, because there's a lot of evidence that really helps. So
definitely.
And in general, students found it pretty easy to use.
Yeah, you had good feedback?
Yeah, they generally were happy with it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you.